Hi, this is Lane Bretschneider, and this is my Phase 4 term project for Info 1010 with Professor Yaz. So here in this project there are three diagrams, and these diagrams show the relationship between three variables over the course of 30 years with these 10 countries. So one variable is population total, and that's going to be a variable throughout all three of the diagrams. And population total will always be shown by the size of these bubbles in the diagram. Um, in this particular diagram, we have growth rate versus telephone lines. Growth rate is denoted on the x-axis, and telephone lines is on the y. And so let's see how this relationship plays out over 30 years. As you can see, there's kind of a general trend of movement upwards and left on the graph. This means that there's an increased number of telephone lines as upward movement goes on the y-axis, and there's also a decreased growth rate for these countries over the time period as shown by the movement left across the x-axis. A few things I want to point out, and I'll show it again, but Russia at one point, its growth rate moves as low as less than negative 0.5%, which is an extremely low growth rate. See, here we go, ready, and there it moves across. Now India, also wanted to point out, India's population is so large that I think it's interesting that compared to most of the other countries in this diagram, its telephone lines are really, really low. Moving on statistically, there's mostly a negative correlation between these two variables that's shown by this trend line here. The equation for the trend line is up in the top right corner, and below that's the r-squared value, which stands for the correlation coefficient. In this diagram, the correlation coefficient is really low. You see mostly 0.0 something values, and that means there's a really weak negative correlation between these two variables here. So moving on to the second diagram, instead of those last two variables, we now move with birth rate and life expectancy. Same 30 years, population total is still the bubble size, and we still have the same 10 countries here. So birth rate's given on the x-axis, life expectancy on the y, and we'll automate it. Here again we see a pretty general trend of upwards and left movement over the 30 years, so this means that there's an increase of life expectancy as the upwards movement goes on the y-axis, and there's also a decrease in birth rate over time with that left movement down the x-axis. A couple things about pretty much all 10 countries have similar life expectancies. You see anywhere by the end here between the ranges of 60 and 85 or so, which definitely sounds like a lot at first, but at least you don't have any major outliers with life expectancies in the range of 30s or low 40s or so. Another thing, all countries except India have very similar birth rates, but you see even from the start, and I'll automate it again, India has a very high birth rate, and even though it decreases over time, pretty much consistently it always has about twice the birth rate as most of the other countries in this diagram. Statistically, there's a negative correlation shown by this trend line here. Equation again is up in the top right corner, and then the r-squared value this time is pretty high. We start off with values of 0.8 and 0.9, and although it decreases over time, it doesn't get any lower than about 0.3 or 0.4, which is still a decently strong correlation. So pretty strong correlation between these two variables in this diagram. Finally, we have diagram 3, still the same 10 countries. Population total is still given by bubble size. This time the variables now are death rate and population density. Death rate is given on the x-axis, population density is on the y, and we'll automate it and see what happens. Basically what I notice is that there doesn't seem to be much of a general trend of movement for the majority of the countries. I think the exception might be India, which does show some upwards and left movement. But throughout the 30 years, most of the countries stay in generally the same place. or at least they end up in a similar place to where they started. Let's see. So in terms of death rate, we see a relatively similar death rate in most of the countries. The exception, obviously, is Russia down here. Russia's death rate starts out pretty similar to most of the other countries, but right around year 12, you see a pretty drastic spike in death rate, and it doesn't really come back down too much after that. By the end, you see a death rate in Russia that's about twice as high as the average of most of the other countries there. Statistically, there's a negative correlation again, shown by this trend line, and this time the R-squared value is back down really low again, back in the 0.0 something values, which means that there's a very low correlation between death rate and population density in this diagram. That's all for my Phase 4 project. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.